Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Fitz.
And welcome to Point of View on this Thursday, October 12th, 2017 day. Kirby Anderson is out today, and I have stepped in for him. And so we are so excited that you've decided to join us this good old October 12th day. We've got a full show for you. We've got a couple of guests that are on, as well as some open lines. And we're going to be talking about everything from the SPLC and their designation of hate groups. And we'll have Alex McFarland, he's the religion and culture expert, and the director of the Christian Worldview and Apologetics of the Christian Worldview Center of North Greenville University. He'll be on later on in the hour. And then at the top of the next hour, we'll be talking to Curtis Houck, who serves as the managing editor for NewsBusters. We'll continue to get into what's been happening in the NFL, especially relative to Roger Goodell and the kneeling that continues to happen, where Christians are really feeling this sense of tension relative to, we believe it to be true from Romans 13, that we need to give honor where honor is due. But we also recognize the truth that the reason why many of these individuals are kneeling is because of some of the racial injustice that they feel is being perpetuated, as well as some of the police brutality that's been documented all too often. But in the meantime, we're going to be taking some of your phone calls as well, so feel free to call in at 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. During the meantime, we're going to be talking about North Korea, specifically in the first hour during our open line session, as well as in the second hour, during the open line session, we'll talk about technology in an article that I had called Just Google It, and what technology is doing to the human experience. But without further ado, let's jump into what's happening in North Korea right now. U.S. President Donald Trump has, quote, lit the wick of the war against North Korea. A Russian state news agency quoted North Korea's foreign minister as saying on Wednesday. The statement follows weeks of escalating tensions between North Korea and the United States, fueled by Pyongyang's repeated nuclear tests, as well as President Trump's tough talk. To quote continually the foreign minister, he says, by his bellicose and insane statement in the UN arena, Trump can be said lit the wick of war against us. And this is probably the most telling line from the statement that was released. He said, quote, we need to settle the final score only with a hail of fire and not words. Now, if you remember earlier this month, President Trump went before the UN and threatened to, quote, totally destroy North Korea. He mocked the country's leader, Kim Jong-un, and referred to him as Rocket Man, and not in the affectionate sense that we continued to hear from Elton John, but necessarily in kind of a bad sense. And then on Wednesday, with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the White House, Trump said that while he listens to others around him, he has a, quote, different attitude when it comes to North Korea. He describes this attitude as tougher. He also told reporters that he wants the U.S. to have a nuclear arsenal that's in, quote, tip-top shape. Now, this was pushing back against what NBC News reported earlier that day, that he had, in a meeting, has said that he wanted to increase the nuclear stockpile tenfold. Writing in a tweet, President Trump said, presidents and their administrators have been talking to North Korea for 25 years. Agreements made and massive amounts of money paid. It hasn't worked. Agreements violated before the ink was dry. Makings fools of U.S. negotiators. Then he says, quote, sorry, but only one thing will work. And left us with this ambiguous sense of what is that one thing that will work. The pessimists on one side have an idea of what that is, but we don't want to speculate any further into that. And so what are we to think of this? What are we to understand of what's happening between the escalating tensions? Has nothing really worked relative to North Korea? Well, that's what I hope we're going to be able to discuss during this first half hour, going back through history and understanding where a lot of this originated, why is there the unrest on the Korean Peninsula, as well as what are some of the things that have happened in recent history that have indicated that the Koreans potentially have the ability as well as the wherewithal to want to be able to cause something to happen. And then from the Christian standpoint, what are we to think of this as well? We'll be taking your calls, so if you have any questions or you have any comments that you'd like to add relative to the North Korean situation during this first half hour, you can call in. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. That number is 800-351-1212. Well, it really does. This North Korean situation, it dates all the way back to 1910. The history of North Korea obviously starts all the way back in 668 AD at the Silla dynasty, but we'll really pick it up in 1910 because it was in 1910 that Japan annexed and colonized the Korean Peninsula. Koreans remember the Japanese colonial rulers as a brutal experience, and Japan developed mines, hydroelectronic dams, steel mills, manufacturing plants in northern Korea. From 1910 to around 1945, we just continue to see this very aggressive rule. We continue to see this sense that there's just that it's very transactional in nature, the relationship between Japan and the Korean Peninsula. And then we'll remember in 1945, the world began to be a little bit more discombobulated and conflict began to dot across the specifically this kind of Asian theater. Because in 1945, specifically on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Soviet troops advanced rapidly, and the U.S. government became anxious because they recognized that they had the propensity to be able to occupy all of the Korean Peninsula, which would be something that would be undesirable relative to foreign relations. And so if that started on August 8th, it was very quickly on August 10th, the U.S. government decided to propose what's now known as the 38th parallel. That was the dividing line between the Soviet occupation zone in the north and the U.S. occupation zone in the south. The parallel was chosen as it would place the capital of Seoul under American control. This division placed around 16 million Koreans in the American zone and around 9 million Koreans in the Soviet zone. This is really where we begin to see the emergence of the Cold War begin to kind of become very much a palpable sense and very real. You see, they were seeking to ensure the maintenance of the respective influences in Korea, the U.S. on one side, the USSR on the other side, and they began to install leaders that were sympathetic to their own cause. And there was mistrust that was on both sides, prevented a lot of cooperation relative to elections that were supposed to choose a leader for the entire peninsula. And so we begin to see two leaders begin to emerge in 1945, really specifically in August of that month. Obviously, what we know to be true is the U.S. handed over control to the southern half to Syngman Rhee, while the Soviet gave control to an individual named Kim Il-sung, power in the north. In 1948, both sides claimed that they had legitimate governments and representative of the entire Korean peninsula. August 15th, specifically, the South declared jurisdiction over all Korea. September 8th, the North declared jurisdiction over all Korea. And then from there, we see a continual escalation to the point that we get to in 1950. And in June 25th, 1950, Kim Il-sung of the North attempted to unify all of Korea under military rule. In June 27th, we see what emerges as this Korean conflict begins to simmer and come to a head. And that's where we're going to stop. And we'll continue forward after the break. But if you have any questions, comments, or anything you like Mike to add, you can call in at 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. And when we get back, we're going to continue. We'll make our way through the Korean conflict and what are some of the ramifications of what happened under the armistice, because we're still under the Korean conflict. No peace treaty has yet to be signed, so it makes it all the more real and all the more possible for the Korean conflict to continue to escalate to where it is today. And we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, for more than 200 years, candidates have been running for elections in districts that were gerrymandered. The term comes from the name of the governor of Massachusetts. In 1812, Governor Gerry signed a bill that changed the district lines for candidates. One of those contorted districts in the Boston area resembled the shape of a salamander, thus the term gerrymander was born. Recently, I learned that gerrymandering goes all the way back to the first congressional elections and involved two of the founders. One of them was James Madison, architect of the Constitution. The other was James Monroe. Both went on to become the fourth and fifth presidents of the United States. In the summer of 1788, Virginia became the 11th state to ratify the Constitution. Governor Patrick Henry called for elections and worked to prevent James Madison from serving in the Senate or the House of Representatives. First, he worked with the members of the Virginia legislature to deny Madison a Senate seat. Back in those days, the legislature selected the U.S. senators. Next, he worked to deny Madison a seat in the House of Representatives. Patrick Henry convinced the Virginia legislature to draw the 5th district line so that they included both Madison's home and Monroe's home. The two friends were forced to compete against each other. During the election, they traveled together and debated each other at various gatherings. Through hard and smart campaigning, Madison managed to defeat Monroe and then serve in Congress. There is a bright side to all of this. During the debates with Monroe, Madison realized how important a Bill of Rights would be. Some of the voters wanted such protection, so he made a campaign promise that he would support a Bill of Rights when elected to Congress. This is one campaign promise that was kept. Within 6 months, Madison pushed through the Bill of Rights, which were later ratified. I suppose you can say that good things sometimes do come from districts that have been gerrymandered. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Based on the incredible true story and best-selling book from Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me, rated PG-13, in theaters October 20th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View, and I am Nick Pitts. I'm in for Kirby Anderson today on this October 12th, 2017 day. And if you were with us during the first segment, we went over kind of what's happened in North Korea, just the current situation of what we find ourselves in. The rhetoric has just continued to heaten up, and threats continued to be lobbed from back and forth. And then we went through some of the history of how it is that we got to where we were, specifically from 1910 with the annexation from Japan of the Korean Peninsula to where the escalation comes to 1950 relative to the Korean conflict. And before we continue forward, kind of walking through this Korean conflict, we've got a phone call. So you can call in, obviously, at 800-351-1212. And we're going to go ahead and take one phone call from Keith in Michigan right now. Keith, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey, Keith, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you very much. And just wanted to say this, that I remember seeing you or listening to you when you were first taking over as being a host. And you're taking this like fish to water. You really are doing a great job.
Well, thank you so much, Keith. Well, I don't want to brag, but I was a YMCA, did swimming lessons at the Y, and I was a dolphin level. So nevertheless, but what's your point of view, Keith?
Well, my point of view is about the Korean War and about the Korean conflict. In 1991 and 92, I served 365 days in South Korea as a armor officer. So we were always having the viewpoint is that there's always artillery, there's always Scud missiles and everything were pointing right at us, and we just lived with it. But one thing that I've observed when I was there back 20-something years ago is that the South Koreans, at least the South Koreans that experienced the Korean War, loved the Americans there. Now, a lot of the younger generation, millennials and whatnot, of the South Koreans hate Americans because of all the propaganda. But I do know that the people who lived through the tyranny and the situation with the Japanese and into what North Korea was doing to the other Koreans, they loved the Americans there because of all the, like I said before, is the tyranny. The thing about it is that it is a great country, a great place of people, and again, as like I said before, is that there was the Scouts and the missiles and everything that was pointing to us. We just kind of we lived with it. It's part of the situation, and that was during the time when I was there. It was Kim Il-sung who was the leader, but now with Kim Jong-il, the guy's a lunatic. Yeah. And so when you start getting to people who are a psychopath of that sort, you really don't know what they're going to do. Yeah. There is no. So I feel for the South Korean people, and they're a great set of people.
Yeah, Keith, thank you so much for your call. You do bring up a really great point. So if we continue back with the narrative, which I think will kind of illuminate and provide some context for what Keith was saying, you had the obviously the Korean conflict from 1950 until June 27, 1953, when the armistice was signed. And again, there was not a peace treaty that was signed, but it was really just an agreement to disagree, that we'll just continue to keep our own ways and keep that 38th parallel pretty solid. But what Keith was illuminating is during his time over there, which we're so grateful for this service of our soldiers overseas, and specifically Kim Il-sung remained in office until his death in 1994. And to all extensive purposes, he really created a powerful cult of personality. North Koreans referred to him under various names, such as the Great Leader, the Heavenly Leader, and even to a certain extent the Sun. A new calendar was introduced, which used Kim Il-sung's birth in 1912 as year one. Every elementary school in the country was equipped with a special training room where young children were indoctrinated in the regime's teachings. Today, an estimated 40,000 statues of Kim Il-sung reside in the country. He remodeled North Korean society along the lines of the Juche, which is North Korean's nationalistic ideology promoting Korean autonomy. Very much a Korean-centric system. And really, one of the manifestations that happened as a result of this is that the state seized control of all private property and organizations. That the state is going to be, to a large degree, the dispenser of goods as well as services. Officially, everything in the country, from businesses to clothes on one's back, belonged to the Korean state. The regime rebuilt Pyongyang as a socialist capital and erected numerous monuments to Kim Il-sung, part of a nationwide effort to build a cult of personality to secure obedience by the people. This is going to be an extremely important point for us to understand, because the meta-narrative, the purpose, the telos of North Korea is I guess you would say, I guess to a certain extent, the existence as well as the survival of the Kim dynasty. They are going to do all things necessary in order to be able to secure the succession of the Kim dynasty. The state took control of all media and restricted all international travel. In 1953, you'll remember that Stalin died, and there was tons of reworking and shifting in order to secure more power. You have to remember that Russia was extremely close with North Korea, because remember, Russia was the one that instituted and placed into position Kim Il-sung. And as a result of this, with all the shifting that happened when Uncle Joe, Joseph Stalin, died, massive inequalities began to emerge in North Korean society. The regime introduced what's known now as the Songbun system, which is still in place today. And for all intensive purposes, the Songbun system is a socio-political classification system. In India, it would kind of be comparable to the caste system. And largely, your position in the Songbun system is contingent upon your loyalty to the regime. We're continuing to see this line of progression that moves individuals, that gives them success as well as gives them proper prominence based upon their obedience to the regime. Under this system, the entire population was sorted into different social classes based upon one's perceived loyalty to the regime. The people's quality of life stagnated, as well as began to drop into a steep decline the longer this system was put into place. Some of the manifestations of that was you just begin to see the lack of goods, the lack of services, the lack of competition that inevitably causes all boats to rise. And because of this, we begin to see something else tragically happens, and some of the weather conditions, because largely North Korea, there's a fishing as well as there's an agricultural component to what North Korea does. Extreme weather conditions in the early 90s caused a great famine to sweep across the land. Some droughts in the 90s also happened, and to the extent that anywhere between 800,000 to 2.4 million people died in the early 1990s because of these weather conditions and because of this socialist system that was put into place that didn't properly provide all the services as well as products and goods necessary for the survival of the people. And to a large degree, what we're going to continue to see because of this is starvation relative to children, stunted the growth of an entire population of the North Korean people. The North Korean government had to lower the minimum required height for soldiers to 145 centimeters. Here in the U.S., that would be 4 feet 9 inches, because it was too tall for most 16 to 17-year-olds. What we continue to see is that we remember that droughts that happened in the early 90s, 800,000 to 2.4 million people died. Well, the population was only around 25 million people. That's a significant amount of people. That would be upwards proportionality to around 30 million Americans in our system that has about 321 million. There was a great extent, and there was a great pressure. Add on top of this the droughts, we begin to see a leadership change that begins to emerge as well. Because in 1994, Kim Il-sung died from a sudden heart attack. And that's when we're introduced to the figure of Kim Jong-il, who had already assumed key positions in the government and succeeded his father then as the General Secretary of the Korean Workers' Party, and inevitably as the dictator of North Korea. During this time, we're beginning to see also in 1994 some really signs that North Korea is willing to work with international partners in order to be able to alleviate some of the suffering, as well as some of the starvation, as well as some of the lack of resources and needs that the Korean people have. And when we see some of this happening, we're beginning to see some respite, or rather some good news that shows us that North Korea is at least willing to work with individuals. And so what happens after that? Well, you'll have to stick around to find out, because after this we're gonna take into a break after this. But after the break, we're gonna bring on Alex McFarland, who is going to help us. He's out of the Christian Worldview Center of North Greenville University, and he's going to talk to us about the SPLC and some of the hate groups, their classification of hate groups, as well as help illuminate, are they really hate groups that the SPLC is designating? And so you'll want to tune in and stick around in order that you might be able to hear from Alex as well. And as well as we'll continue to take your phone calls. So if you'd like to call in, you can call in at 800-351-1212. And we'll be back right after this.
Sometimes I joke that I'll win the lottery when God blows the winning ticket across a parking lot to me. I don't buy tickets, so if he wants me to win, that's the way. Pretty silly, right? But a lot of us take a similar stance when it comes to the ills of our culture. We don't do anything. We simply hope things will change. I encourage you to get in the game and make things change. Join Truth Team 360 and be part of a work that changes lives and communities. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
From Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me. Ron and Debbie Hall have everything they could ever want, except for a loving marriage. But when Debbie befriends a homeless man, their lives begin to intersect, and they are all changed forever.
Amazing how far a little tender love and care can go.
Same Kind of Different as Me, based on the true story, in theaters October 20th, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. More information is available at samekindofdifferentasmemovie.com.
Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am Nick Pitts, filling in for Kirby Anderson today, and we've got joining us over the phone Dr. Alex McFarland. Alex, are you there?
I'm here. Good afternoon.
Hey, Alex, so great to have you. Alex, for our listeners, Alex serves as the director of the Christian Worldview and Apologetics, director of the Christian Worldview and Apologetics at the Christian Worldview Center of North Greenville University. He's the co-host of American Family Radio Talk Network's Exploring the World talk show, and also the co-host of Viral Truth, which is a radio and TV program. He's authored 19 books. His newly released book is Stand Strong in Your Faith, Live What You Believe with Confidence and Passion. It's co-authored by fellow Christian apologist Jason Jimenez. And Alex, we are so glad that you decided to join us today.
Well, thank you. It's always great to be on. Listen, I've got such a great respect for all that you guys do, and every chance I get, I listen to Point of View Radio, so to be on is very special.
Well, you're very kind. You're very kind, Alex. Well, let's jump right into it, Alex. We were introduced to, we kind of previewed to our listeners earlier, right before the break, kind of what we're talking about relative to the SPLC and hate groups. And so the SPLC, being the Southern Poverty Law Center, they have now come up with a number of 917 hate groups that are operating in the U.S. That seems like a pretty significant number. Is there more to that number, Alex?
Well, hate to the left is anybody with whom they disagree. And it's very sad that the hate card and the accusation of malice and forethought and evil intent has become a substitute for critical thinking skills. I mean, it's so sad that if somebody comes along and believes in moral absolutes, as our founding fathers did. I mean, the framers of the Declaration and the Constitution and the great people, Christian people, and people just of basic morality who built and sustained this nation. Nowadays, they would be haters. Jefferson, Franklin, the 56 signers of the Declaration, they would all be, supremacists and haters in the eyes of the SPLC. So what's so sad is this: because the progressive left wants to justify really moral relativism and hedonism, that there are no moral boundaries, premarital sex, extramarital sex, homosexuality, transgenderism, abortion. They want there to be no moral boundaries. The only moral absolute has become that there are no moral absolutes, and if you intimate or imply that there are, you're a hater.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. What we continue to see, what was so perplexing is also what appears to be hypocritical is that the very same people that were lamenting and mourning the death of Hugh Hefner were also the ones that were up in arms about Harvey Weinstein and some of the allegations that have come out against him. It really just doesn't make any sense right now.
It really doesn't. I mean, the left is so hypocritical, so their positions and their assertions are so contradictory. I wrote an op-ed when Hugh Hefner died several weeks ago, and, I read this, Nick, that they said he was obsessively afraid of death, and he made 2,485 scrapbooks documenting, like, every step of his life and what he had for lunch on a certain day. One writer said, as if the meticulous, obsessive keeping of all these scrapbooks would somehow stave off his mortality. He was obsessively afraid of death. And, frankly, here's a guy that bragged he had relations with more than 1,000 women. His fear of death, that was a very legitimate fear. But, his legacy is that of a human wrecking ball. I mean, he did more to break down the family, to promote the pornography industry, and to really damage people sexually, physically, psychologically. He was very famous for the Playboy Mansion. And, he could have had a mansion in heaven, but his priorities were of this world, not the next. But you're right. I mean, they celebrate the licentious, lawless frankly, godless life of an atheist, Hugh Hefner, who is the mayor of exploitation of women. But then they will, turn against Harvey Weinstein, and rightly so. I mean, if he did all the things of which he's accused, he should be, condemned. But let me just say this. Because we have lost our moral compass, because we are morally adrift as a nation, the left has no card to play other than the hate card. But if I may, let me give you one more thing. Did you see, Nick, in the news yesterday how at Oxford, Christian groups are excluded? They have a freshman fair. They call them freshers, but they're freshmen at Oxford. And this is a traditionally Christian institution. C.S. Lewis taught there. But this open freshman fair where there's clubs and there's, campus amenities, and you learn kind of the environment of Oxford. It's free, one come all, except Christians. So everything is tolerated except those that don't tolerate everything.
Yeah.
Isn't it selective tolerance? That's intolerance, isn't it?
You're right. So it always reminds me of G.K. Chesterton's definition of tolerance, that some people are so open-minded that their brains are falling out.
That's right.
And it seems as though you bring up a really great point. There just seems to be this relativity of we're not willing to be consistent relative to any moral bounds whatsoever, that we can celebrate the life of Hugh Hefner, but then two, lament what Harvey Weinstein has rightly. We should lament, and we should be up in arms about what he's done. But it just seems what's very troubling, if we go back to what the SPLC has put together, is they have this number of hate groups that they've continued to perpetuate and put out there. This idea that there's 917 hate groups, but they're willing to label such Probe Ministries, for example, as one of those hate groups, because they're willing to take a stand and they're willing to say that we love you enough in order to tell you some discomfortable as well as just some hard truth, but we're really concerned about your long-term health. It just doesn't seem to be making sense to us.
Well, exactly. And that's, the left, if we don't see some people have some moral and intellectual backbone and be willing to stand up to a ludicrous group. Let me tell you, the Southern Poverty Law Center is a group that basically is a waste of oxygen and resources. I mean, they contribute no good thing to American life. They really don't. And in fact, people who are intellectually vulnerable and uninformed and fall for their lies. I mean, they're a group. Let me say this. I was on a show back during the election cycle a year ago, and, I was talking about the fact that, think about this, if 2017 had been 1776, we wouldn't have a constitution, because the founders presupposed moral absolutes. They presupposed that every person has an obligation, a moral accountability in light of the, you can call it natural law or self-evident truth, or as Dr. King called it in 1963, our Judeo-Christian heritage. By the way, the SPLC should read While We Can't Wait by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because by their definition, he would be a hater. And really the civil rights movement, because they believed in moral truth and moral absolutes, they would be a hate group. But I was on a show and I was talking about, if 2016, 2017 had been 1776, we wouldn't have an America. And somebody in one of the comments on one of the websites tweeted about me defending moral truth, said, quote, "Can't somebody out there kill this blank, blank, blank," meaning myself. In fact, a law enforcement agency contacted me and said, "Hey, do you need protection?" I said, "No, believe me, Jesus has my back."
Yeah.
But, where's the outcry when a leftist tweets to the whole wide world, "Can't somebody out there kill this guy?" There's an article for one of the major news websites. Nobody addresses the argumentation or the content. They just tweet things like "burn in hell, maggot." And I hate to use that type of language. It's just you have to understand the left is all about tolerance until you're a voice of dissent or a voice of disagreement.
Yeah.
Now, we don't hate these people. We don't wish these people ill. We love these people. But they need to know that there is truth, and it is incumbent on all people to not only recognize truth, but to amend their lives in light of truth.
Yeah, it just makes it all the more important for organizations like yours to be able to continue to speak the truth in love. And so when we come back, we're going to continue to talk to Dr. Alex McFarland, and we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The United States military probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Jewish High Holy Days. Yet thanks to our country's dedication to religious liberty, our military has often shown its respect for the faith of its service members. Back in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, about 5,000 Jews served in our country's military. 4,000 of them put in for furloughs in order to attend services for the Jewish high holidays. By 1944, the Nazis had exterminated almost every Jew in the French village of Verdun. A year later, 500 Jewish American GIs would gather in Verdun's town square to observe Rosh Hashanah. That same September, on the other side of the globe, B-29 crews occupied the island of Guam. For many of them, it would be their last Rosh Hashanah. The hangar was converted to a Jewish house of worship under the direction of the commanding general for that station, himself not Jewish. Still, men of all faiths built seats, a pulpit, the Holy Ark for Scriptures, erected lighting, and even a sound system. 1,500 men would pray for, quote, peace to him who is far off and to him that is near. These are just a handful of ways in which the United States military, even during times of war, acknowledged the essence of the First Amendment, that men have a great duty to the Creator, that government must respect. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View on this October 12th, 2017 day. We've been joined by Dr. Alex McFarland, who is the director of the Christian Worldview and Apologetics at the Christian Worldview Center of North Greenville University. Alex, are you still there?
I'm here.
Good to hear from you. We've been talking about the SPLC and their recent release of the actual hate groups that are here in the U.S., and it says 917, and Alex was really helping us to better understand that number is just a mirage, that there's some really great groups that many of our listeners would be very familiar with, everything from Probe Ministries to as well as James Kennedy Ministries were labeled as hate groups. And it seems as though there's just this hypocrisy on the left, and it's just very difficult, but it's also very problematic for Christians, because they're lumping Christians in with the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists.
Yeah.
This is very troubling, Alex.
Well, it really is. I think about the American Family Association, and it's been my privilege for a little over 8 years to do a daily radio show with the American Family Association. And FA does, a lot of broadcasting and publishing, but, whenever there's a natural disaster, they go and help people, and they partner with other ministries like Samaritan's Purse or 8 Days of Hope. And I remember a few years ago when there was a hurricane or a tornado rather, that swept through the southeast, and a lot of people were homeless. And I was there with AFR, and we were helping rebuild a house that had the roof torn off. And I mean, American Family is just one group. I'm not an employee of them. I just do a show on their network, but they do thousands of things throughout the year that, in addition to promoting the gospel of Jesus Christ, are tangibly meeting human needs. You can't call this a hate group. I think of Franklin Graham and Samaritan's Purse, and Franklin Graham has so courageously proclaimed the truth of Jesus Christ, the love of Jesus Christ, as his father did for so many decades. And listen, I know from speaking at, a couple of dozen universities a year, people that don't know the Lord, people that don't know moral truth, and people that have, by public education, been really indoctrinated into this social justice warrior mentality. They've been really groomed to hate people like Franklin Graham or even myself, because they've been taught by very left-leaning liberal professors, moral libertines, that anybody who has any ethical boundaries is a hater. And so I just pray that the majority of the American people who are intelligent enough to see through this ideological, smoke and mirrors, I hope people will be able to see beyond all this.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really great point. This is troubling for a number of instances, but it's not necessarily surprising. It's troubling because, like you said, the Christians are usually the ones that are on the front lines when it comes to natural disasters, when it comes to some of these tragedies. Look no further than Hurricane Harvey. Look no further than Puerto Rico, and Texas Baptist men specifically. I can recount were some of the first ones on the scene in order to be the hands and feet of Jesus to help people that were in time of need. This is troubling that these groups would be labeled hate groups, but this shouldn't be surprising for us because we remember what Jesus said, and everything from John 16:33. Don't be surprised if you have trouble in this world, to Peter in 1 Peter 4:12, where it says, don't be surprised by the fiery trials, to even Paul is going to give a very strong admonition to young Timothy when he says, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life will be persecuted. So we shouldn't be, we should be troubled by it, but we shouldn't be surprised by it, right?
Exactly. And one of the ways around it, obviously prayer and the work of the Holy Spirit, but building relationships and intentionally trying to build friendships with persons with whom we disagree, and you build trust and honesty and respect. And, we really it's an uphill battle, granted. We have to kind of earn the right to be heard. Well, let me just say this. We've in America, we've always been a country where, you're free to believe whatever you want to believe. You can believe, truth, or you can believe delusions. However, what's different about our culture in recent years is, we've always believed that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but we're to the point where the assumption is everybody is entitled to their own set of facts. And now it's just become dogmatic that there is no ultimate truth. Everybody has their own truth. And it really reminds me, Nick, of Judges 5:8, ancient Israel. It says that when they chose new gods, there was chaos within the gates. And so we really face the Constitution being endangered because, let me say this, if you talk about moral truth like the sacredness of life, abortion is objectively wrong. they say, well, you're violating the First Amendment, which is the establishment, contains the Establishment Clause, and there's this push, and there's virtually no, voice of dissent coming out of the pulpit, that the recognition of moral boundaries does not constitute a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. First Amendment says the government's not going to establish a state church or tell you how to do your church services, but the First Amendment does not mean that we ignore or abolish all moral parameters, moral boundaries.
Yeah.
And so we're in a dangerous place that, obviously we don't want the government establishing a religion, although the religion that is being imposed on all of us is secular humanism, really. But we must recover the recognition of objective moral boundaries, or we're just going to slide further into anarchy.
Yeah, you bring up a great point when you illuminated the Judges text. It reminded me kind of towards the end of the chapter, specifically in chapter 17:6, as well as 21:25, that in those days Israel had no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So not only is there no objective truth, but it just seems as though we're living in the midst of chaos because there's a way that seems right for man, but it ends in destruction. So, but there are some good things that are happening. Specifically, you've got some great things that are happening right now. For our listeners, where can they access some of that information, as well as tell us what some of the things that you're working on, some of the great work that you're doing?
Well, God bless you. Thank you. Listen, I want to ask everybody to text the word revival to 555-888. I know that's not a complete phone number, but believe me, I'll get it. 555-888. Text the word revival. And I write an article at least 2 or 3 times a month. We send out articles, the very same articles that I do for like Fox News and LifeSet.com and other New York Times, you name it. We send to all of our people that follow us first. But we're doing a camp next summer, an apologetics camp, July 22nd through 26th, an apologetics camp. I'll be there. The faculty of North Greenville will be there, and we're going to have fun. We're going to play volleyball and do all that good, fun camp stuff, but we're also going to train middle schoolers and high schoolers on how to love God and country and defend the faith. And so my own website, alexmcfarland.com. If you want to sign up for the camp or you want to bring your youth group, it really, really is phenomenal. You can go to truthforanewgeneration.com. But again, the quickest way to stay abreast of what we've got a major, and by the way, Nick, I want to, first time anywhere, we haven't gone public with this anywhere, but I'm going to go public with it now. The next one of our Truth for a New Generation apologetics conferences is going to be March 23-24 in Greensboro, North Carolina. Text 555-888. Word revival, and we'll keep you informed.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much, Alex, for joining us, and we'll be right back after this commercial break.
Chuck Bentley of Crown Financial Ministries believes you hold the key to powerful and lasting change. You can be a hero.
Are you happy with what you're seeing in our culture? Are you really pleased with the direction of this country? If you're not, then do your duty. Give. Make an investment. Put your money where your heart's desire is to make a difference.
You don't need a colorful cape and costume to be a hero. All you need is to get off the bench and into the game, and to support the fight for faith, family, and freedom. Join the team. Join Truth Team 360 with Point of View Radio. We need heroes to step up this week, today, and do what you can. Visit pointofview.net/team and choose your level of support. Be an important part of Point of View's 45-year legacy of changed lives and changed communities.
It will be a gift that pays off for eternity.
Pointofview.net/team, or give by calling 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome to Point of View. My name is Nick Pitts, filling in for Kirby Anderson today on this October 12th, 2017 day. We're entering into our second hour, but I'll recap of the first hour. We talked a little bit about North Korea, what's been happening in North Korea relative to all the way back in 1910 with the annexation of kind of the Korean Peninsula by Japan, and then really got up to the kind of the Korean conflict, and then what happened out of that, and some of the ramifications of some of that, the kind of oppressive regime of the Kim dynasty. And then when we come back on the second hour, we'll continue to touch back and kind of fill in on what are some of the ramifications and things that have been happening since the 1994 agreement that was signed under the Clinton administration. Then we ended up had a chance to talk with Alex McFarland of the North Greenville University. Alex was really helping us better understand that 917 hate groups, or supposed hate groups, that the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, has labeled. Understanding that that we should be troubled by their understanding of hate, but not necessarily surprised, because after all, it was Jesus that told us that we will have trouble in this world from John 16, that Peter told us, don't be surprised at the fiery ordeal that comes upon you, as well as what Paul would tell a young Timothy, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life will be persecuted. So blessed are those that are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And coming up in the second hour, but right now, we've actually got a great guest on, Christopher Houck. Christopher, are you there? Or Curtis, rather.
Yes, Curtis Houck, yep.
Hey, Curtis, so great for you to join us. Curtis serves as the managing editor of NewsBusters after almost 2 years as the news analyst in the Media Research Center's News Analysis Division. During that time, he served as the sole evening news analyst, and he was chronicling the best and worst of network news evening programming. So, Curtis, so glad that you decided to join us today.
No problem. Great to be with you.
So Curtis is going to help us understand what's happening right now with the NFL. This kneeling has been happening. It really got started under Colin Kaepernick back in 2016, where initially he was sitting down, but then under advisement decided to start kneeling during the national anthem. But now we're today, Curtis, and the commissioner, Roger Goodell, is entertaining the idea of enforcing a protocol relative to the national anthem. What can you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. This is it. When this directive came out, that the commissioner and the owners are thinking about this ahead of series of owner-player meetings, owner meetings, league meetings, whatever you want to call them, coming up. He put out a memo entertaining this notion that, again, that he will enforce a rule that he would conceive about standing for the national anthem and respecting the flag. And so obviously that hasn't sat well with the players. And from our perspective at the Media Research Center at NewsBusters, we decided to look at the media coverage of this memo, which is clearly siding with President Trump and where he's kind of come down on this and what a majority of the American people feel about this, to the initial outrage when the president made his comments talking about what he thinks players should do during the national anthem. And we found a staggering disparity, which I think is really important to unpack here. For a lot of studies for the Media Research Center, as a side note, we chronicle the morning and evening newscast of ABC, CBS, and NBC. And from the first news cycle, so a morning and evening show, after Trump's comments, the first weekday after Trump's comments, the networks gave 63 minutes of coverage attacking the president's decision that players should stand and respect the American flag. Okay? So we have that. And then recently we found this week that this memo, coverage of that memo for the first news cycle afterward, only 6 minutes on that. So we're talking about a disparity here where the president seems to have come out on top here, and it's 6 minutes versus 63 minutes when the outrage machine was in full effect and the news media was trying to convince so many people to join to their side and make it seem like the only side of the issue that was reasonable and we're standing on was players kneeling and signing with Colin Kaepernick, who, of course, as some people may or may not know, wore socks last year, suggesting police officers were pigs.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. Some of the numbers that you illuminated, the idea that they covered this the kneeling for such a vast amount of time, but then just gave such little time to Roger Goodell and the memo that was sent out that appears to be aligning with President Trump's kind of stance relative to the disrespect of the flag. Help us to understand, Curtis, I'm just so intrigued by this. It seems as though there's really, not only is there just a disagreement with individuals that are tuning out of these newscasts because of just some of the politicalization of the newscast and the objectivity that's just gone out the window with Walter Cronkite. Help us to understand, has the NFL suffered any popularity downturn because of this?
Well, there's been some talk. I think, first of all, regardless of ratings, I think the first week after a few weeks ago with all the players kneeling and after the president's comments, a number of NFL teams or the league itself, I can't recall, but one of those two lost a few kind of million Facebook likes on their page. So that's social media engagement, which in this day and age is, monetized as far as clicks and likes and things like that. That's kind of replaced in the news business what used to be advertising and classifieds back in the day. That kept news organizations afloat as kind of the public square, I guess, of ideas, which has been replaced by social media. So people not tuning in that regard. You have ratings going down in some regards and across, pick certain games or ratings. I'm not sure what the ratings were like for Monday Night Football, but I'm assuming they were pretty good. And the media may try to use that claim, but then again, the Star Wars trailer was shown during halftime, so you had a number of people tuning in to see that, unrelated to football, what was going on the field. But so there are a number of things to unpack here with the rating. This is already not sitting well for a league that has been having issues with the perception about concussions. A number of franchises in St. Louis and San Diego moving to Los Angeles, and the city of Los Angeles being generally apathetic to that. The league has already had a number of problems that's causing people to turn out. So I think any decline should be put into context, and it's just being exasperated by these protests that have been going on here. So I think this is just another problem for the NFL, and why you see college football is continuing to do as well as it has, because one, where there's more games. Two, people of all political stripes are united by their universities that they went to, or just geographic relationships based on where they live. So all those things together, and you don't see players talking about disrespecting the flag because these are young men playing for their school and university and making them proud, whereas the players are basically playing for themselves and their money.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, especially I grew up in the South before the Tennessee Titans came to Tennessee. And there was just a great affinity for the college team. One, just because we recognized it to be true that usually those younger players have a greater passion as well as a greater intensity to be able to represent their school. And two, there doesn't seem to be that entitlement that often comes with a kind of a larger paycheck. And so it does seem
there's relatability.
Yeah. There's just
in terms of where geographically, like you may know some of the players or know of the schools that they went to, whereas with the NFL, everyone's so jumbled up, and there's only so few people that actually make it into the NFL as NFL players. So there's even less of a relatability, and vice versa. The players feel so disconnected from the people that they support.
Yeah, that's great. We're going to continue with this line of thought because this is really interesting relative to kind of the juxtaposition of professional sports and college sports, especially when professional comes politicalized. So we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, for more than 200 years, candidates have been running for elections in districts that were gerrymandered. The term comes from the name of the governor of Massachusetts. In 1812, Governor Gerry signed a bill that changed the district lines for candidates. One of those contorted districts in the Boston area resembled the shape of a salamander, thus the term gerrymander was born. Recently, I learned that gerrymandering goes all the way back to the first congressional elections and involved two of the founders. One of them was James Madison, architect of the Constitution. The other was James Monroe. Both went on to become the fourth and fifth presidents of the United States. In the summer of 1788, Virginia became the 11th state to ratify the Constitution. Governor Patrick Henry called for elections and worked to prevent James Madison from serving in the Senate or the House of Representatives. First, he worked with the members of the Virginia legislature to deny Madison a Senate seat. Back in those days, the legislature selected the U.S. senators. Next, he worked to deny Madison a seat in the House of Representatives. Patrick Henry convinced the Virginia legislature to draw the 5th district line so that they included both Madison's home and Monroe's home. The two friends were forced to compete against each other. During the election, they traveled together and debated each other at various gatherings. Through hard and smart campaigning, Madison managed to defeat Monroe and then serve in Congress. There is a bright side to all of this. During the debates with Monroe, Madison realized how important a Bill of Rights would be. Some of the voters wanted such protection, so he made a campaign promise that he would support a Bill of Rights when elected to Congress. This is one campaign promise that was kept. Within 6 months, Madison pushed through the Bill of Rights, which were later ratified. I suppose you can say that good things sometimes do come from districts that have been gerrymandered. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Based on the incredible true story and best-selling book from Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me, rated PG-13, in theaters October 20th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View, and I am Nick Pitts. I'm in for Kirby Anderson today on this October 12th, 2017 day, and we are joined over the phone by Curtis Houck. Curtis serves as the managing editor of NewsBusters after almost 2 years of serving as the Media Research Center's News Analyst Division. Curtis, are you still there?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Curtis was bringing up a really great point right before we had to go to a break with the kind of the politicalization that's happening in professional sports right now, with everything from the kneeling to the socks to just all sorts of little efforts and gestures that are being made by professional athletes. It's almost as though we're moving back towards the college campus and moving towards individuals that really are. There's just a gravitation because of proximity, because of intensity, a better product that's being played on the field relative to college football. I can attest because of my alma mater, Austin Peay State University. Curtis, I don't know if you know this or not, but Austin Peay had the longest active losing streak in the country in college football coming into the season at 29 games. So it's something that we boast of as Austin Peay alum. But just this season, we actually went on a 3-game winning streak. But nevertheless, I'll stop chasing that rabbit. But it did bring up this line of questioning for me that I was really interested in hearing your opinion as someone that's giving particular attention to the media. You know, there used to be a day that it seemed as though journalism school was held in pretty high regard, and the idea of being a journalist was something that you really had to earn and you had to vie for after years of kind of schooling, as well as experience and mentorships and these peer groups that would really, there was the respected schools such as the University of Missouri, there was the University of Texas at Austin, NYU, Northwestern. But it now seems as though we're living in a world that really popularity is what earns you the title of journalist. Am I right in my thinking, or am I off somewhere?
Right. The media are looking at kind of where journalism and newspapers have been struggling recently. And they cite issues such as advertising and political polarization, and I'm not going to discount those things, but I think what journalism schools have been teaching a lot of students, and what these leftist center journalism students have been doing, is their role models and people who they want to emulate and be like are national journalists who are located in 3 areas: New York, Washington, and Los Angeles. And there was an amazing statistic by a liberal journalist. I'm not going to make any bones about it, Bob Schieffer. I believe it was him. He said last week, I think it's like 1 in 5 journalists live in those areas, which is just simply astounding. Again, in this day and age of going after a Republican president, when, now that the Obamas are gone and their friends have left, the media's friends have left the White House, journalism has suddenly come roaring back as a thing now. So journalists are now flocking to Washington, flocking to New York, looking to be the next Woodward and Bernstein, when there's journalism that needs to happen in all these different places, in state capitals and local small towns. I grew up in a place called Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where the Amish live.
Wow.
And there's need for reporters to cover school board meetings and high school football games, and journalists nowadays are not interested in that. They are chasing the more attractive and seductive stories of Washington and the dysfunction of Washington, and looking to take down this administration in any way possible, suddenly being concerned about the use of taxpayer dollars and a number of other things when their time could be spent elsewhere. And I think, again, this is what's so seductive and what's such a problem about, I guess, as President Trump says, the swamp, is that it is so attractive to a lot of people because of the power and the wealth that comes with it.
Yeah, you bring up a really great point, Alex, or rather, Curtis, I'm sorry about that, that there used to be a journalist that they would work towards a conclusion, that they would have the evidence and they would gather the evidence and try to put together a compelling story in order to be able to build up a case that reached a conclusion that was fact-checked and verified. But now it seems as though we have quote-unquote journalists that have conclusions, and they're taking evidence that isn't necessarily quality evidence and trying to push their preconceived notions. They're trying to push their kind of biases onto the public. And it really is, you bring up a really great statistic in the sense that, yes, there's an extent that the individuals are moving towards the cities, but we also have to remember that some of this local journalism is dying just because there's not the popularity, which leads to clicks, which leads to eyeballs, which leads to dollars.
Exactly. And it all just kind of, it's one thing right after another, the media may try to put it on 1 or 2 kind of pegs of the stool, but I think, the way a stool works is if you knock out one, everything else just kind of goes from there. And again, you just have the level of vindictiveness. You look at what the national media is doing with the Harvey Weinstein story, about how NBC News had the story, they refused to publish it. It's just a level of shamefulness and willful neglect by the news media that they, I guess they think that people won't find out about their misdeeds, or people won't find out, in the case of Brian Williams, that they were lying, or in the case of to bring it back to sports, ESPN's Jamel Hill, that she would be tweeting all these things that would go astray of a company's social media policy. And that would hurt the company, as she had done with her, that led to her suspension, encouraging a boycott of advertisers in the league, which included her own network, since they do show Monday Night Football. Again, just to bring it back to a bigger point, the journalists are more interested in their own opinions as opposed to just being being a part of the paper or an institution. People talk about, decry conservatives for lack of respect for institutions like journalism. I think it's journalism themselves that are undermining themselves and hurting themselves by showing a lack of respect for their own institutions, by making it about themselves and about their hot takes, as people like to say, than letting the facts speak for themselves. You look at a place like The Economist magazine, it's a British magazine, there's no authors listed there. Everyone else kind of has to give up their ego to just, the articles there are just presented without names.
Yeah.
Whereas in American newspapers, and especially a lot of the ones you see today, people are known by their names. That person works on CNN. They opine on CNN. They're also an MSNBC political analyst, and that's another piece of it too. So to attract eyeballs, and they would make the argument, rightfully so, that it draws clicks to their site because, oh, I want to read what this person has to say because I saw them say something on the show. But again, it's at the end of the day, it is a toxic kind of symbiotic relationship that's going on here, and it's really not helpful.
So, Curtis, help us for a second. So, individuals that are listening right now, there's a variety of different news sources that have been made available to us just because the advent of the internet and just the continued popularization and just the ubiquitous nature of news outlets today and kind of the free license to call yourself a journalist if you have a camera and you have a blog. And so help us in this fake news era because, again, I think it's an important distinction to make. Biased news isn't fake news, but all fake news tends to be biased news. So in this fake news era, what are some sources of truth? Where can we go? What are some tips that you can give listeners to help try to get to the bottom of it so that they can detect the biases, they can see the falseness that's kind of pervasive in today's society?
Well, what I tell people, and I tell family members, and later this month, my brother's a high school teacher, and I was speaking to his class, and tell them that there are a number of sources out there, and I recommend to people to read all types of sources, to not just insulate yourself and fall victim to confirmation bias. I think it is important to be challenged. We here at the Media Research Center and NewsBusters, not just because it's our jobs, but we enjoy reading opposing viewpoints. You enjoy, at least some of us do, old souls like myself, physically reading the Washington Post every day. And looking at things like that. So I would encourage people to just kind of stay with those sources. But I think what's more important nowadays is to ask yourself questions as you're reading the story. Where did this person come from? What is their history? Do they have motivations? What have they said on television? And that's where we at NewsBusters come in because we have a paper trail for what people say on television that we find to be biased or noteworthy. And so then it just gives people a level, an extra layer of understanding and things to consider, good or bad, when they go into reading something. So I would suggest that support for your local news is important because I know everyone likes to read, who's in the unfortunately who's in the obituaries or the high school football team. Read all those scores and stuff on Saturday mornings. They love that. I think that is important. But I would just consider that you look at the source, you look at the presentation of a site. Just because it's not the New York Times or something else doesn't mean that, all sites, that aren't as well put together mean they are fake. But just basic looking at a URL, I think is so important.
Yeah.
If something is like CNN International Desk, something or other that I saw today that conservative thought leader had that I'll remain nameless fell for. That is the type of thing that people need to be responsible for. You look at the URL. If you're looking at sites that are in your Google search results that are at the back, chances are that's a problem.
Yeah, as what Abraham Lincoln said.
.com, .org, it's pretty simple.
Yeah, as Abraham Lincoln said, you can't believe half of the things you read on the internet. And so, Curtis, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back right after this.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View on this October 12th, 2017 day. We just got off the phone with Curtis Houck, who serves as the managing editor of NewsBusters, who has really given us some clarification on what was happening relative to the news media coverage of the Roger Goodell and kind of the kneeling situation, but also gave us some great tips and insights into how do we discern what truth is and what's good and what's right in kind of this fake news era. But now to pick back up where we started the show in the very first hour, we were talking about the North Korean situation and how it really, this kind of discombobulation, this kind of conflict has really been brewing underneath the surface. Really, we can trace it all the way back to 1910 when Japan annexed the Korean Peninsula and really just created just a brutal, very difficult situation for the Korean people during that time. Then we jumped forward to 1945, and when Russia kind of came in and took over the northern part of the island of Korea, and then we had the 38th parallel that separated the north from the south. The U.S. would take control of the south and bring into power Syngman Rhee, and then the south brought into power an individual by the name of Kim Il-sung. And so we were talking about that and some of the difficulty and the escalation that's been happening on the Korean Peninsula. And then we've jumped ahead all the way to 1994, detailing the kind of the atrocities and the difficulty of living underneath the Kim Il-sung and his regime of really trying to institute socialistic policies, as well as just some of the natural disasters that happened relative to the drought that killed in the early 90s, that killed anywhere from 800,000 to 2.4 million people on an island that's only numbers 25 million. And so it's just very tragic. And so we've also been taking some of your phone calls relative to North Korea as well. And we're going to continue to open the lines. And so you can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. And we're going to spend the rest of our time, the 24 minutes that we have left together, really trying to unpack as well as better understand this North Korea situation, which brings us all the way up to 1994. Like I said, in 1994, Kim Il-sung, who was really the first individual, an individual that was known as the Sun, the great leader in North Korea, he died from a sudden heart attack on July 8th, 1994. And then his son took his place, Kim Jong-il. And when he took his place, it wasn't similar to what we experienced back when Kim Jong-un assumed power. That was a relatively unknown individual. But Kim Jong-il had been someone that had assumed key positions in the government. Also happening in 1994 is something very significant that happened. In 1994, faced with North Korea announced the intent to withdraw from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that was signed into existence and entered into in 1985. This requires non-nuclear weapon states to kind of at least acknowledge the development and acquisition of nuclear weapons. But what happened in 1994 was very significant in that North Korea signed the agreed framework. And under this agreed framework agreement, what happened is Pyongyang committed to freezing its illicit plutonium weapons program in exchange for aid. Remember how we talked about earlier during the 90s, they suffered great drought to the extent that upwards of 2.4 million people died in a country where only 25 million people live. And so while they were willing to set aside some of their nuclear development in 1994 under what was known as the agreed framework during the Clinton presidency in order to achieve some aid, well, the second major diplomatic effort began to start in 2003. In 2003, the second major diplomatic effort was six-party table talks. It was initiated in August of 2003. It involved China, Japan, North Korea, Russia, South Korea, and the United States. In between the periods of stalemate and crisis, those talks arrived at critical breakthroughs so that when in 2005, North Korea pledged to abandon all nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs and return to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And in 2007, when the parties agreed on the series of steps to implement what was agreed upon in 2005. Well, what's so significant about this is we see two gestures by the North Koreans in relatively recent history, that have shown that they're willing to come to the table and work together. This kind of goes against what President Trump has been saying recently, that they're just not willing to talk, that there's been no progress that's been made in the past. Well, it appears as though there has been progress being made. It appears as though there has been movement. Now, granted, that doesn't take away from the fact of the human rights abuses that have been happening in North Korea, the atrocities that are happening there. This doesn't take away from the fact of the rhetoric. This doesn't take away from the fact of them violating the sovereignty of Japan. There's just some very bad things that are happening. But we have to give credit where credit is due, and there does appear to be at least some progression and movement that's happening. But what happened specifically in 2011 was a significant turn. You'll remember in 2011, on December 17th specifically, Kim Jong-il passed away. His passing was something that happened relatively quickly, just like his father. But unlike the transition from the father to the son, this transition to the father to the son, Kim Jong-un, the new supreme leader, really was not well known within the international community. He was the international man of mystery, one might say. Tensions between North Korea and other countries increased because under Kim Jong-un, in an effort to prove himself in very much an honor-based culture, he increased the rocket launches as well as the nuclear bomb testing. And as a result, the UN sanctions have been tightened, but not necessarily adhered to. What was interesting that happened is that trade was topping out in North Korea with China at $6 billion in 2015. What the North Koreans were able to produce were minerals, seafood, and garments, and they were really relying upon China as their primary trading partner. Because remember, the UN sanctions were very much being heeded by by the majority of other countries that are in the UN, but were not being heeded by China. China, you'll also remember during this time in 2015, they were in a precarious financial situation, so they were in desperate need wherever they could find it. And so now where we find ourselves is that North Korea is very much tied to China, that they're very close partners. There's a very close partnership there. But also we have to recognize the truth that North Korea is in a very weak situation right now. North Korea is estimated to have a GDP, a gross domestic product, of about $28 billion. That's similar to Turkmenistan. In comparison, the U.S. GDP stands at around $18.57 trillion. And putting into perspective that $28 billion that North Korea boasts as its GDP. So what is the modern day strategy for North Korea? Why are they operating the way that they are? Well, remember what I said back in the first hour, specifically in 1945, and kind of came about again in 1953, that we just saw very vividly and clearly through Kim Il-sung. What Kim Il-sung is doing is he is very much pushing towards and driving towards the survival of the Kim dynasty. That their main modus operandi, the meta-narrative, their telos, is that the regime would continue to be perpetuated forward into the future. Everything that they do is move towards survival. Hence the reason why the nuclear proliferation, the continual nuclear stockpiling that they're doing, and the testing that they're doing. They're wanting to build up a weapon system in order that they might be able, that when an individual or another entity or country could potentially attack North Korea, they might be able to respond likewise. What was very fascinating is an individual named George Freeman wrote a book called The Next 100 Years. George Freeman operates a think tank organization and kind of a group called Stratfor that helps with geopolitical matters. And what Freeman advances is the idea that North Korea operates off a threefold strategy. They are ferocious in nature, is the first prong of this strategy. North Koreans have positioned themselves as ferocious by appearing to have or be on the verge of having devastating power. They want to be seen as this just unlikely figure, this ambiguous figure that is ferocious in the extent that it's going to do anything that it can in order that it might be able to survive. But the second prong is almost on the opposite end of the spectrum. They want to appear as though they're weak. This positions them as being weak, such that no matter how ferocious they are, there's no point in retaliating against North Korea because they're eventually going to collapse on themselves. They give us glimpses of their weakness relative to their economy, relative to the difficulty of life in North Korea, and it tries to subliminally tell us there's no point in engaging with North Korea or going against North Korea because inevitably they're going to fall upon themselves. But then the third prong, if there's the ferocious, which is the first prong, the second prong being weak, the third prong is being crazy. They've positioned themselves as crazy, meaning pushing against them would be dangerous since they're liable to exchange in the greatest effects imaginable at the slightest provocation. It reminds us of the old axiom, beware of the man that has nothing to lose. They portray themselves as crazy, working and appearing to be unpredictable, and given to extravagant threats and seemingly welcoming of war. So that we have this three-pronged strategy that North Korea appears to be operating in, and if you look back at the news that's been happening over the past 6 months, you can see each one of those prongs being utilized, the ferociousness, the weakness, the craziness. And when we get back after our commercial break, we're going to see what are some of the ways that we can think about this from a biblical perspective. As Christians, how can we understand what's happening with North Korea and what our response to North Korea should be? And we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The United States military probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Jewish high holy days. Yet thanks to our country's dedication to religious liberty, our military has often shown its respect for the faith of its service members. Back in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, about 5,000 Jews served in our country's military. 4,000 of them put in for furloughs in order to attend services for the Jewish high holidays. By 1944, the Nazis had exterminated almost every Jew in the French village of Verdun. A year later, 500 Jewish American GIs would gather in Verdun's town square to observe Rosh Hashanah. That same September, on the other side of the globe, B-29 crews occupied the island of Guam. For many of them, it would be their last Rosh Hashanah. The hangar was converted to a Jewish house of worship under the direction of the commanding general for that station, himself not Jewish. Still, men of all faiths built seats, a pulpit, the Holy Ark for Scriptures, erected lighting, and even a sound system. 1,500 men would pray for, quote, peace to him who is far off and to him that is near. These are just a handful of ways in which the United States military, even during times of war, acknowledged the essence of the First Amendment, that men have a great duty to the Creator, that government must respect. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we are back on Point of View for this last 9-minute stretch. My name is Nick Pitts. I'm in for Kirby Anderson today, and we have been talking about the North Korean situation, and we've charted all the way, if you've been following us, all the way from 1910 and the colonization by the Japanese, all the way up to where we are in present-day China, or present-day Korea. And just to give you a kind of an update on what's been happening relative to the North Korean situation, we'll go just as recent as 3 days ago, or rather earlier this month. Earlier this month, the president appeared before the UN General Assembly, And when he was before the UN General Assembly, he used the remarks that there was an individual, President Trump rather, threatened to totally destroy North Korea. And he mocked the country's leader, whom he referred to as Rocket Man. With an appearance with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the White House on Wednesday, Trump said that while he listens to others around him, he has a different attitude when it comes to North Korea. That attitude can be described as, quote, tougher. Trump also told reporters that the U.S. nuclear arsenal is in tip-top shape, quote, and he's pushing back against the NBC report that happened yesterday that said that he wanted to increase the nuclear stockpile tenfold. Well, for individuals that are for the decrease of nuclear weapons across the world, this becomes very troubling, to say the least. But for those that see North Korea as a very significant threat, this seems as though just the next prudent, wise thing to do, especially if North Korea is operating out of that three-pronged strategy of being ferocious, of being weak, of being crazy, largely dependent upon which prong they use is because of the situation that they find themselves in. And we'd love to hear your point of view in this last segment. And so you can call in at 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. That number one more time is 800-351-1212. And we're going to continue to talk about North Korea as we kind of exit the show today. But what was so significant is what happened just even yesterday when the foreign minister for North Korea said that, quote, Donald Trump's rhetoric has, quote, lit the wick of war. And he goes so far as to say at the very end of his statement, which I think is the most telling, we need to settle the final score only with a hail of fire and not words. Well, this is very heated rhetoric that continues to go back and forth between the president as well as between the North Korean officials. And so I think we can all agree that coming to when individuals are launching these nuclear weapons, that is a no-win situation for anyone. It's a loss of life that specifically goes against what we would hold in the biblical narrative to be life that's valuable, that has dignity, and inevitably life that probably is innocent. That there are a few individuals within the North Korean regime that are operating and acting in a way that is inconsistent with the biblical narrative. But there are many individuals, upwards of 25 million North Koreans, that do not have a voice in North Korea. And so the idea of lobbing a nuclear weapon over at them would be detrimental to what we would say as a pro-life ethic. Because there is, even though there's so much bad that's going on in North Korea right now, I think it's really important for us to highlight the good that's happening in North Korea right now. What C.S. Lewis says is, for the Christian, is Aslan is on the move. We might not see it, but there is something that's beautifully happening in North Korea right now, and I'd love to tell you about it. Elizabeth Diaz at a Time magazine documented that there are upwards of 200 Christians that are living and moving in North Korea right now. That they're very much meeting physical needs in order that they might be able to speak to the spiritual needs of these individuals that are in this communist socialist society. These are individuals that are very hungry for the truths of Jesus. And what Elizabeth documents in her Time magazine article that I highly recommend to you is that these are individuals that are medical missionaries, they're teachers, they're medical professionals that are providing some of these services in order that they might earn the right to be able to speak the gospel message, that Jesus is making his way even into the closed country that is North Korea. That there's a university that's operating. The only private university in North Korea right now is the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology that is doing great work within the country right now. There's quite a bit of good that's happening in North Korea that largely is not representative of their leadership right now. And so to be able to, this conflict and this rhetoric that continues to be ramping up higher and higher could be detrimental to the extent that someone could actually act on it. And then just imagine the lives that could potentially be lost because of someone acting on this rhetoric. Now, we're going to continue to take your calls, and we've got one call from a caller in South Carolina. Are you there?
Yes, sir, I am.
Oh, yes, sir. What is your point of view?
My point of view is simply this, that on each individual issue that we've had with North Korea, every single time we actually had something set down in stone for them to follow, they backed off from it. My point of view is simply this, is at what point are we going to stop talking and actually, I'm an advocate for peace and I'm an advocate that we ought not to go to war at all, but at what point are we going to identify that the individual actually don't want to work with us, and the only time that they want to talk anything about peace is when they want us to pay for something.
Yeah, you bring up a really great point that there has been a sense that they haven't been obedient to some of the conditions that we've laid down before, relative to back in 1994 as well as in 2005. But there has been a sense that they have heeded kind of some of the guidelines and the directives that we have laid down in the past as well. There's been this mixed match of being, yes, they've pulled out of some of those agreements, but there's also instances where they were kind of heeded some of the directives that we had. Specifically, when we talk about what was happening in 1994 with the agreed framework, as well as in 2003, rather. I apologize for misspeaking there. In 2003 with that agreement as well of trying to come down to figure out what we can talk about. But what we're continuing to see is just there's this sense that we really are just in a very precarious situation right now where we just aren't quite sure what's actually going to happen. And then from the Christian, we kind of have three traditional perspectives relative to what the Christian could do. And so kind of coming out of the biblical narrative, there have been three ways that we can kind of respond to conflict from a kind of national standpoint. One being the pacifist approach, and that kind of is rooted in Matthew 5:39. Do not resist an evil person, Jesus says. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him also on the other. Pacifists adopt a nonviolent means of opposing their enemies, such as hunger strikes, public rallies, or eye-catching protests, but they refuse to take up arms. And so there are certain individuals that are kind of assuming that pacifist position relative to North Korea. There are others that are advocating for a preemptive war strike. Many preemptive war theologians look to God's commands that the people initiate war specifically against the Canaanites in Joshua, specifically Joshua 6:5, as well as Joshua 8 as well. This is the trying to move in such a way that allows that we strike first in order that they might not strike us. We remember the Joshua narrative where the people of God are moving into the promised land of God, and they're told to strike down the Canaanites. But what appears as though that would be a little bit more difficult for individuals that were combating that preemptive war position. They would say that that was just a context. That was for a certain time and certain place. In a hermeneutical speak, that would say that that was more descriptive of a situation than prescriptive for a people. That was good for the Canaanites, or rather good for the people of God in Joshua during the ancient Near Eastern times, but not necessarily as applicable for the people of God in 2017. And then there's the just war theory. To run over just in our short amount of time that we have left, the just war theory, it's kind of there's 7 postulates. Let's move forward. Is it a just cause, a defensive war? Is it a just intent, fought to secure justice? Is it last resort? Have we done all possible means? Is there a legitimate authority, such as a military force authorized by proper government powers? Are there limited goals that are achievable? Is there non-combatant immunity? Are civilians going to be protected? And finally, proportionality. Is the good gained must justify the harm done? And there are many individuals that are looking towards those 7 postulates to try to figure out, does the North Korean situation fall into that? And well, who knows what will happen? But here's what I do know: that the Lord God of the universe has called us to be He is sovereign one, and He has called us to prayer too. So I would encourage you to pray not only for our enemies but also for our leaders as well. And that's my point of view. We'll see you tomorrow.
Does point of view make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as district health director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with point of view? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty, greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team. Or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you